The night was dark and stormy, the kind where lightning splits the sky and thunder rumbles like the gods themselves are at war. In the year 597, a small ship landed on the shores of Kent, carrying a man named Augustine and nearly 40 followers. They were monks, sent by Pope Gregory the Great on a mission to bring Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons. Little did they know that their arrival would mark the beginning of a new era, one that would reshape the destiny of a land still echoing with the remnants of Roman rule. For centuries, the British Isles had been a melting pot of cultures and conflicts. The Romans had left, taking their legions and their order with them, leaving behind a vacuum of power. In the east, Germanic tribes, Saxons, Angles, and Jutes had begun to settle, sometimes invited as mercenaries to protect the land, other times as conquerors seeking new territories. The west, however, remained a stronghold of the Britons, descendants of the Romanized Celts, who clung to their lands and their traditions. Augustine and his monks brought more than just a new religion. They brought the arts of reading and writing, skills that had been lost in the chaos of the post-Roman world. This was a time when history was not written but passed down through oral tradition, where bards and storytellers kept the past alive. But with the arrival of the monks, the Anglo-Saxons began to record their own stories, their own triumphs and failures, in a way that would last for generations. The story of the Anglo-Saxons, however, did not begin with Augustine. Long before the monks set foot on British soil, the foundations of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were already being laid. The kingdoms of Kent, Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, among others, had already taken shape, each with its own ruler and its own struggles for power. These early kingdoms were born from the chaos of the late Roman period, when the withdrawal of the legions left the land vulnerable to invasion and internal strife. One of the earliest accounts of this period comes from a British cleric named Gildas, who wrote in the mid-6th century. Gildas was a man of strong opinions, and he saw the Anglo-Saxon invasions as divine punishment for the sins of the British people. He described how the Britons, desperate for protection, invited the Saxons to settle in the east as Federate soldiers. At first, these Germanic tribes seemed to be loyal allies, but over time, they grew stronger and more confident, eventually turning on their hosts and wreaking havoc across the land. Gildas' account, though biased, provides a valuable glimpse into the early years of the Anglo-Saxon settlements. But the story of the Anglo-Saxons is not just a story of invasion and conquest. It is also a story of survival and adaptation. The Britons, too, had their own leaders, their own kings, who rose to power in the vacuum left by the Romans. These kings, whom Gildas called tyrants, ruled with the support of their war bands, groups of loyal followers who were bound to their leaders by ties of kinship and honor. The society they built was violent and chaotic, but it was also resilient, capable of enduring in the face of overwhelming odds. As the 6th century progressed, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms began to take on a more defined form. The kings of Kent, for example, traced their lineage back to Hengist and Horsa, two brothers who, according to tradition, arrived in Britain in the mid-5th century. The West Saxons, or Wessex, claimed descent from Cerdic and Cynric, who are said to have landed in the south of England around the same time. These founding myths, though likely embellished over the years, reflect the importance of royal lineage in Anglo-Saxon society. To be a king was to be descended from a line of great leaders, and this ancestry was a source of both power and legitimacy. The archaeological record, too, provides a rich and complex picture of this period. From the remains of early Anglo-Saxon settlements and cemeteries, we can see that the settlers were a diverse group, with varying origins and motivations. Some were warriors buried with their weapons, while others were farmers and artisans, bringing with them the skills and traditions of their homelands. The distribution of these settlements suggests that the Anglo-Saxons did not simply conquer the land, but gradually integrated into the existing social and economic structures. In some areas, they settled near Roman towns and roads, possibly as part of federate arrangements, while in others, they established new farming communities in previously unoccupied regions. The story of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms is one of transformation, a tale of how a land once ruled by the Romans became a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, each with its own unique identity and culture. It is a story that began not with the arrival of Augustine and his monks, but with the complex and often violent interactions between the Britons and the Germanic tribes that had come to call Britain their home. As the monks set foot on the shores of Kent, they were entering a world that was already changing, a world that would soon become the Anglo-Saxon England we know today. Bede, a monk from the 700s, wrote about how Germanic tribes like the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes came to Britain after the fall of the Roman Empire. He believed these tribes came from specific areas in the North Sea region and settled in particular parts of Britain. Archaeologists have found that Bede was mostly right, but the story is more complex. For example, the Jutes left less evidence of their presence compared to the Angles and Saxons. Archaeologists have also discovered that the people who settled in Britain were not just from one group. They mixed with each other, and this is shown in how they dressed and buried their dead. Some areas in the south and east of England had cemeteries where people were buried both by cremation and in graves, showing a mix of traditions. There were also other Germanic groups, like the Franks and Scandinavians, who settled in Britain. The Franks settled in areas south of the Thames, and Scandinavians were found in East Anglia and along the eastern coast. However, it's sometimes hard to tell if artifacts found in Britain came from settlers, or were just trade goods. For example, many Frankish items found in Kent were likely due to trade, not settlement. While the Germanic settlers were arriving, the Romano-British people who lived in Britain were already changing their way of life. By the late 300s, many Roman towns were declining. In places like Wroxeter and Exeter, people started living in simpler wooden houses instead of stone ones. Some areas of these towns were even abandoned or turned into farmland. Similar changes happened in other towns like Canterbury and Winchester. The decline of Roman towns meant that by the 400s, towns were no longer the main centers of population. Some rural areas like villas initially benefited from the changes, but eventually they too adapted to become more self-sufficient. For example, at Froster and Rivenhall, old villa buildings were either abandoned or turned into barns, and new wooden buildings were built. The attacks by the Anglo-Saxons and the Irish made life harder for the Romano-British, but they were already facing economic and social changes due to the decline of the Roman Empire. By the time the Anglo-Saxons arrived, the Romano-British were already adapting to a new, early medieval way of life. By the end of the 400s, the eastern part of Britain, where the Anglo-Saxons settled, looked different from the western part, where they did not. In the west, old hill forts were reoccupied and used as centers of power. South Cadbury, for example, was refortified, and a large timber hall was built on top. However, the Romano-British people in the west became hard to find in the archaeological record because they stopped using Roman-style artifacts and started using items that don't survive well in the soil. In the east, where the Anglo-Saxons settled, large cemeteries with thousands of burials might make it seem like the newcomers overwhelmed the native population. However, these cemeteries were used for hundreds of years, so the communities they served were not as large as they might appear. For example, Spung Hill in Norfolk, which had over 3,000 burials, probably served a population of only 400 to 500 people spread over a wide area. Most people living in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were likely of Romano-British descent. The Anglo-Saxons did not settle in an empty landscape, but in one where the Romano-British were already living. Landscape studies show that there was a lot of continuity between Roman and Anglo-Saxon rural settlements. Some Anglo-Saxon settlements were even established with the help of the Romano-British. For example, the boundaries of Anglo-Saxon estates often matched those of Roman villas. This suggests that the basic structure of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was inherited from the late Roman period. One of the best examples of this continuity is Yeavering in Northumbria, which was a royal center used by Anglo-Saxon kings. The site had large timber halls and a unique wedge-shaped building that resembled a Roman amphitheater. Despite its Anglo-Saxon use, the site had British and Roman roots. Similarly, at Cowderies Down in the Basingstoke area, large timber halls were used during the 500s and 600s. These halls, like those at Yeavering, show a mix of Germanic and Romano-British building traditions. This blending of traditions is an important part of the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. As the 500s progressed, we see evidence of the emergence of Anglo-Saxon kings. Some burials became much richer, with mounds and a wide array of grave goods. The most famous of these is the ship burial at Sutton Hoo, which might belong to King Riedwald of the East Angles. These rich burials, often called princely burials, indicate the growing power of Anglo-Saxon leaders and the development of kingship. By the 600s, there were many small kingdoms in England. The most detailed information about these kingdoms comes from the Tribal Hittite, a list of peoples and their land assessments. This document, which was probably compiled in the 600s, shows that the land was divided into many smaller territories. The assessments in hides, a unit of land, reflect the size and importance of each territory. For example, the West Saxons had an assessment of 100,000 hides, which might be an exaggeration reflecting their later growth. The Tribal Hittite also shows that some areas were under the control of larger kingdoms. For example, Wulfhere of Mercia was an overlord of many smaller territories. This document provides a glimpse into the political structure of early Anglo-Saxon England, where many small kingdoms existed and were often under the influence of more powerful ones. In the world of 7th century Anglo-Saxon England, the landscape was dotted with various political units, each with its own unique story. These units, known as the Tribal Hittite, ranged from large and well-known kingdoms to smaller, less documented groups. The Tribal Hittite was a list that assessed the land and people for tribute, giving us a glimpse into the complex political structure of the time. Among the largest and most powerful of these units were the West Saxons, who controlled a vast area of about 100,000 hides. The East Angles and Mercians each had 30,000 hides, while the people of Kent, known as the Cantwerna, had 15,000 hides. These large kingdoms continued to thrive into the 8th century and had their own royal families. Next in size were several peoples, who each had 7,000 hides. These included the Riocenseat, the Magenseat, the Lindsey, the Hwicks, the East Saxons, and the South Saxons. Most of these groups had their own royal houses, except for the Riocenseat, about whom very little is known. There were also smaller groups, with between 5,000 and 2,000 hides. The Chiltern Seat, who lived around the Chiltern Hills, had 4,000 hides. The Hendrika had 3,500 hides, and the Knoxgaga and Oatgaga had 5,000 and 2,000 hides, respectively. The exact locations of the Knoxgaga and Oatgaga are unknown, and their names might have been altered over time. Finally, there were about 20 small groups, with between 300 and 1,200 hides. Some of these, like the people of Elmet and the Isle of Wight, had their own rulers known as kings or princes. The South Jirwi, who lived around Ely, also had a ruler, though he was called a prince rather than a king. A map of the Tribal Hittite shows the locations of these groups as accurately as possible. Some names, like Knoxgaga, Oatgaga, and Unekengaga, remain mysterious and cannot be placed. Even for the known groups, it is challenging to draw exact boundaries, especially for the smaller peoples in the East Midlands, who lost their independence early on and were absorbed into larger kingdoms. Despite their varying sizes, all 35 groups listed in the Tribal Hittite were likely of the same status, each ruled by its own royal house and assessed independently for tribute. This is suggested by Bede's account of the Battle of the River Winwood in 655, where Penda of Mercia, the overlord of the southern kingdoms, was supported by 30 contingents, each led by a royal commander. However, not all rulers were of Germanic origin. The Kingdom of Elmet had a British ruler in the early 7th century, and it is thought that the Chiltern seat might have been under native control for much of the 6th century. By the end of the 6th century, many of these small provinces had likely existed for some time. The West Midlands had some of the latest formed provinces, like the Magenseat and Hwicks, while the East Midlands had a high concentration of small provinces. This might reflect either the political organization of the area or Mercian interests. The southern and eastern coasts were the first areas settled by Germanic peoples, and were among the earliest to fall under Anglo-Saxon control. These regions had easy access to other Germanic territories across the North Sea and the Channel, which helped them grow and expand. By the end of the 6th century, some of these coastal kingdoms, like Kent, Lindsey, and Dara, were already beginning to annex smaller neighbors. This expansion likely encouraged other areas to form their own military leaders for protection. Kingship was widespread by the end of the 6th century, but the nature of early Anglo-Saxon kingship is not well understood. Some kings claimed descent from Germanic heroes and gods, like Woden, to legitimize their rule. The ship burials at Sutton Hoo and Snape suggest a possible link between the East Anglian royal house and the Vendel dynasty of Sweden. Anglo-Saxon kings were primarily war leaders, and their success in battle was crucial. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and other sources emphasize their victories over British kings and the collection of tribute and booty. The most powerful kings could claim overlordship over other kingdoms, a system sometimes referred to as the Bretwaldership. The relationship between a king and his warriors, known as the comitatus, was essential. The king provided for his warriors, and in return they fought loyally for him. This bond was celebrated in Old English heroic poetry, such as Beowulf, which describes the reciprocal nature of this relationship. The king's hall was the center of this bond, where feasts and gift-giving reinforced loyalty. Archaeological evidence, like the halls at Yeavering and Cowdery's Down, shows that these places were used to support the king and his followers. The hall at Yeavering, for example, was grand and could have rivaled the great feasting hall of Heorot in Beowulf. The Sutton Hoo burial, with its rich grave goods, provides a vivid picture of the wealth and power of early Anglo-Saxon kings. In this world, war was a central concern, and the king's military strength was the foundation of his rule. The relationship between the king and his warriors was crucial for the success and survival of the kingdom. This dynamic, rooted in both tradition and practical necessity, shaped the early political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. In the early days of Anglo-Saxon England, the king's role was more than just a figurehead. He was the heart of the community. By the year 600, the king's influence extended beyond his immediate followers, the warband, to include all the people in his kingdom. The earliest surviving law code, created by Ethelbert of Kent, shows the king's responsibility for maintaining law and order. This law code covered everyone in society, from nobles and free farmers, ceorls, to unfree peasants and slaves. A key duty of the king was to set and enforce the fines for wrongdoings, which varied based on a person's status. These fines helped prevent small disputes from turning into blood feuds. The king also protected foreigners, like traders and missionaries, who were not part of the usual kinship and lordship ties. Breaking the king's protection was a serious offense and was punished harshly. The king had a financial interest in keeping the peace, because part of the fines for serious crimes went to him. This arrangement gave the king a strong incentive to enforce the law and maintain order. Over time, this responsibility helped expand the king's powers. The kings of early Anglo-Saxon England drew much of their authority from Germanic traditions of kingship and lordship. However, they were also influenced by other cultures, especially the Franks of Francia. Francia, a powerful kingdom in what is now France, had a significant impact on southern England in the 6th century. There is evidence that Francia even took tribute from some southern Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The connection between Kent and the Merovingian royal house of the Franks was particularly strong. Frankish goods like pottery and wine were widely found in Kent, and the local nobility often adopted Frankish styles in dress and food. These goods were not just luxuries. They were symbols of power and status that the kings had to acquire to maintain their authority. The influence of Francia extended beyond material goods. Ideas and cultural practices from Francia likely spread throughout southern and eastern England. The similarities between the Sutton Hoo ship burial and those from the Vendel period in Sweden suggest that there were broader Germanic concepts of kingship that influenced the Anglo-Saxons, possibly through trade and cultural exchanges. Despite Bede's emphasis on the Germanic roots of Anglo-Saxon kingship, the influence of the Romano-British background was significant. Bede, a monk and historian, often downplayed the importance of the Romano-British past, partly because he was critical of the British for not converting the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. However, recent studies show that the organization of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms likely had Roman roots. Many of the inhabitants of Anglo-Saxon England were of Romano-British origin, and Anglo-Saxon kings often used Roman symbols to reinforce their power. For example, Bede describes how King Edwin of Northumbria used Roman-style banners and standard-bearers to enhance his majesty. The Sutton Hoo ship burial, with its Roman-inspired regalia like the helmet and shoulder clasps, further illustrates this connection to the Roman past. The adoption of Christianity by the Anglo-Saxons brought new links to the Roman world. Kings like Edwin used Roman symbols and practices to project an image of power and authority, drawing on the legacy of the Roman emperor. This Roman influence was not just a matter of symbolism. It also provided the Anglo-Saxons with new skills and administrative techniques. The study of Anglo-Saxon kings and kingdoms in the 7th to 9th centuries is limited by the scarcity of written record. Many kingdoms did not exist long enough to produce extensive written material, and even for those that did, the survival of documents varies greatly. The kingdom of the South Saxons, for example, was an early dominant kingdom with rich archaeological evidence, but it left few historical records. We know the names of some South Saxon kings and a bit about their interactions with other kingdoms, but the internal history of the kingdom remains largely unknown. The primary sources for studying these kingdoms come from the Church, which kept detailed records of royal grants, saints' lives, and annals. These documents often reflect the interests of the religious communities that produced them. Kings were the main benefactors of religious houses, and their grants and other activities are well documented in these archives. However, the survival of these documents depends on the continuity of the religious houses that preserve them. For example, the East Anglian royal house, which lasted until 869, left no pre-Viking charters because the Danish settlement destroyed most of the religious communities. Charters, or written grants, are crucial for understanding kingship. They record the ruler's name, title, and the details of land grants, along with a list of witnesses. These witnesses can provide insights into the power structure within a kingdom. The authenticity of these charters is often debated, as many were altered or improved over time, especially in the later Anglo-Saxon period when religious houses sought to reclaim lost lands. Rignal lists and genealogies, which may have pre-Christian origins, are also important. These lists show the reigns of kings and their family pedigrees, though they were often manipulated for political purposes. The most extensive collection of these documents is the Anglian collection, believed to have been compiled in Northumbria in the late 8th century. The purpose of this collection remains unclear, but it may have been related to claims of overlordship. Old English poetry, preserved in ecclesiastical archives, provides valuable insights into the secular aristocracy. The poem Beowulf, for example, reflects the values of lordship and the adaptation of these values by the Church. Despite its mythological elements, Beowulf offers a glimpse into the mentality of the Anglo-Saxon elite and how their values were influenced by Christian teachings. Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731, is the most important source for understanding the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Bede wrote this history to interpret the Anglo-Saxon past in terms of the Old Testament, showing how good and bad behavior influenced a kingdom's fate. Anglo-Saxon kings provided many of the examples in Bede's work, and he hoped that readers would be inspired to follow the good and avoid the bad. Bede's history, while focused on the Church, also reveals much about the secular world of the Anglo-Saxons. His work shows how the king's actions and the kingdom's standing with God were closely intertwined. Through his writing, Bede hoped to guide the Anglo-Saxons towards a better future, one that would be blessed by God. Bede was a monk who lived in the early 8th century in what is now England. He was deeply interested in understanding the history of the Anglo-Saxons, the people who settled in Britain after the Romans left. Bede believed that history was a way to see God's plan for humanity, so he worked hard to gather and write down as much information as he could about the past. To do this, Bede asked for help from other monasteries and religious places across the country. People sent him documents and stories, both written and oral. Some of these stories were like legends, with heroes and miracles, but Bede tried to sort out what was real and what was just storytelling. One of his biggest challenges was figuring out when things happened, because different kingdoms had different ways of counting years. Bede tried to use a single system to date events, which was a big help to historians who came after him. Bede's book, called the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, is one of the most important sources for understanding early English history. He wrote about the kings, the church, and the everyday lives of people. While Bede sometimes had his own opinions, he was careful to include enough information so that readers could form their own thoughts. He paid special attention to the kingdom of Northumbria, where he lived, but he also wrote about other parts of England. Bede was not just a historian, he was also a teacher and a religious figure. He wanted the king of Northumbria, Ceolwulf, to learn from the past and to be a good leader. Bede believed that understanding history could help people make better decisions in the present. After Bede, other historians and writers in Northumbria and Wessex continued to record events, creating annals and chronicles. These records, along with archaeological findings and studies of coins, help us piece together the history of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. However, some areas, like Mercia, are less well documented, which makes it harder to understand their history. One of the best documented kingdoms is Kent. Kent has a rich history, with stories of kings, saints, and conflicts. Bede had a good source of information about Kent from Abbot Albinus of Canterbury. Other important sources include legal codes, church documents, and the legend of St. Mildred, which tells of the murder of 2 Kentish princes and the founding of a monastery. The history of Kent is also tied to its origins. According to old stories, the kingdom was founded by Hengist and Horsa, who came to Britain at the invitation of a British king named Vortigern. These stories are more legend than history, but they show how important the past was to the people of Kent. Archaeologists have found evidence that the Jutes, a Germanic people, settled in Kent and brought with them a unique culture. Kent also had strong ties to the Franks, a powerful kingdom in what is now France, which helped Kent become wealthy and influential. Kent was divided into 2 parts, East Kent and West Kent. East Kent was richer and more culturally distinct, while West Kent was more similar to the neighboring Saxon areas. The 2 parts had their own kings for a while, but eventually they were united under one ruler. Kent also had connections to the Isle of Wight and parts of Hampshire, which suggests that the Kentish kings had interests beyond their own borders. The most famous king of Kent was Ethelbert, who ruled in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Ethelbert married a Christian princess named Bertha, which helped bring Christianity to Kent. He was a powerful king who controlled other southern kingdoms and was known for his laws and good governance. His reign marked a significant period in the history of Kent and the broader Anglo-Saxon world. Through the work of Bede and the sources that followed, we can see the rich and complex history of the Anglo-Saxons, a history that continues to fascinate and inform us today.